my name is Doug Beckett, and this is the UNBC Energy Transition Group. And we have Kyle giving us a presentation tonight on carbon accounting. And Kyle, I'll leave it to you to ad lib and introduce yourself and
Thank you very
get
much.
into the presentation.
And thank you, Anne, for your help. Okay, so yeah, thank you and Remembrance Day. So I'd just like to take a moment, of course, because people have sacrificed, and I'm one of those guys who does not think Canada's broken. I think Canada's an unbelievable place to live, and I'm proud to be here for sure. So thanks, Doug, for having me. Doug and I go quite a ways back when you were still putting electric engines in old trucks and your wife screaming at you. And so we appreciate how far you've gone. You're an early adopter, yeah, on steroids, we'll say. Okay, so today I'm here to teach you guys about setting up a greenhouse gas footprint. And so, it's become a lot more important for a company to have a footprint. I'm going to tell you why that is. It's not just about regulated bodies anymore. So I'm going to teach you how to go through it. So I remember I emceed a wedding once and I didn't introduce myself. And halfway through, everyone was saying, well, half the chatter out there is like, who the hell are you? And so I always try and make sure to introduce myself quickly. I won't spend too much time, but I'm a proud alumni of this university. I did a master's degree here in global environmental policy. During that time, I also had the opportunity to work for Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. So as a student and an employee at the same time, it gave me a lot of freedom here. And this university, it lets you grow. If you have the ambition, you can do things here. So exciting. What else can I tell you? Greenhouse gas inventory quantification. That's through the Canadian Standards Association. So they did used to have a whole process and testing level. Now they're a little bit less hands-on and you have to do it elsewhere. But as I said, I work for some interesting places. These two seem to be counter to each other, but they're really not. I think that you'll be surprised to see that a lot of even the top 2,000 companies in the world right now are trying to make a difference. They don't want to do things poorly. If they can do things better and in a more sustainable way, they're really open to it, but they just can't break the bank to do it. So there's a bit of a balance. And right now, I have taught at the University of Northern British Columbia carbon accounting, but I'm usually doing it through the Center for Canadian Institute for Energy Training right now. And so I've been doing it all over Canada. Moncton, I think, is the furthest east I've gone, but it's surprising online right now. So online is really the category where a lot of people are doing a lot of training. Okay, so that's about me. So tonight, we're just going to quickly go through why greenhouse gases are important. It might seem kind of self-explanatory, but I think people skip past this. The conversation about climate change doesn't seem to happen a lot. We're discussing these carbon taxes and this and that and cost of living, and it's like no conversation about what could be the most significant impact we're seeing in our lifetime. So we'll talk about that just a little bit. But then I'll get into who's measuring their greenhouse gases and why. As I said, it's not just regulated entities right now. And then we'll go through the 3-scope system. If you've heard of that before, you'll hear of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. ISO language just uses direct, indirect, and energy indirect or other indirect, but we'll talk about that. And then I'll give you some conclusions on what I think is going forward. And I have one slide on just the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero, as I think that that's something important right now, and people are really missing the boat on that. Okay, greenhouse gases. So as I told you, I want to explain the whole graph on the left. I think we all know the basic greenhouse effect. If you've been in a greenhouse in the winter, I grew up in Kamloops. My dad could start growing stuff early in that season, right? The impact of having that layer trapping in that heat is significant. And we've known about this in scientific books for, years and years. In the 30s, they were talking about this. We have some famous quote, Thomas Edison, we hope we don't have to run out of all these dirty fuels before we get to the solar and wind projects. And sure enough, he almost hit it on the head. Here in BC, I think we're seeing lots of impacts, atmospheric rivers. If you've driven anywhere in the province in the last 2 years, you've driven through construction, you've driven through messes. Even White Rock Pier got wiped out. They're not going to build it the same way they used to because they know climate change is here and it's probably here to stay for a while. So we're adapting and we're building things stronger. But I always want to just take a moment on this slide because a lot of the conversation ignores the most serious impact that's causing all this conversation. Why we're measuring greenhouse gas, why we're concerned about it. It is a dramatic issue. People who are young in their 30s have never seen that change, right? Climate's over a 30-year period. It's constantly be changing in the last 30 years. You talk to some old timers who are 80 or 90, they could plant seeds on May long weekend. They knew the birds were coming within a week or two. Like the First Nations, some of the elders who were most respected were those who could tell the weather and what was coming. They don't even try anymore. The changes are significant. And if we don't address them in this decade of action, which is already halfway through, yeah, we might have some repercussions. So greenhouse gas is just a little bit of science before we get into it. These are the 7 main greenhouse gases that we measure. If you've ever seen 6, the original Kyoto was 6 gases. We added this last one, nitrogen trifluoride. It's used in all the production of our screens, our big screen TVs, all our laptops. And they found that, as you can see, the global warming potential is very significant. And what I mean by a global warming potential is that we compare all these gases that have a greenhouse gas effect, a heat trapping, a radiative forcing, and we compare that all back to carbon dioxide because it's the dominant greenhouse gas in our atmosphere by far. But if you look at these, there's some pretty dramatic differences. Methane, 28 times as bad. Nitrous oxide, 265. A lot of times in a carbon footprint, these are the only 3 that you'll see because these are getting into specialty things. You know, if you're a electricity producer or a chemical producer, you might see some of these, or if you're making LCD screens. But if you run through a carbon footprint, you only see those first 3. Don't think it's a poor footprint. They are the ones that come along for most organizations first. If you've ever seen that show Cowspiracy, it drives me a bit crazy because they're trying to do well. They're trying to highlight what is the most impact on the climate. But they claim that all us environmentalists who've been working on our life for half the wage that we probably could have made are part of this conspiracy to make it sound like it's transportation and not cows. Well, what they're doing is they're using a different global warming potential. If you see at the top, I'm using a 100-year period. If you go down and shrink it to a 20-year period, methane jumps out. It hits you like a hammer. But we've all agreed we need to have one period of time to agree to, and we're hoping to be around 100 years, not just 20. So, you know, we balance that out. But if you take that one detail out of that movie, their entire argument falls down. So you do have to be careful with these things. But all I want to say with this slide is that we're converting back into one thing called CO2e. And so CO2e is the only one that you're going to see on a metric on a carbon footprint. So no one's going to stop and explain, oh, we have this much carbon, we have this much methane, we have this much nitrous. We want to have one number. What's your carbon footprint? And that number is always converted back to the CO2e. So we convert those radiative forcings to equal. And I'll show you a bit of math later just how to do that. It's fairly straightforward. So who's measuring their carbon footprint? You know, regulatory compliance in Canada definitely drove it for a lot of years. Any company over 100,000 tons of emissions per year is considered a large final emitter, and they're pretty much regulated across Canada. Again, different provinces have their different rules. But even if you're over 10,000 tons, you've usually at least been reporting. You might not have regulation, but they've asked you to report. So a lot of companies have been doing this, but what kind of shocks me is the greatest pressure coming is from the investor and stakeholders. Big companies like BlackRock investors, billions of dollars. They now want to see the sustainability report. They believe it reduces risk. You're looking at a company from a different perspective than you ever had. Who's that? An efficiency expert out of the States called Michael Porter. He has what's called the Porter hypothesis. He thinks environmental regulations are actually good for a company because it makes them more malleable and bendable. And now they can see where they haven't seen before. They're looking under those crevices. And when you do a footprint, your entire supply chain, you do see things that you might have seen, not seen before, especially risk-wise. And then really the stakeholders, it'll shock you, like Lululemon, and athletics company out of Vancouver is getting sued by their own investors because all they've been doing is outsourcing their stuff and trying to move scope 1 and 2 emissions to scope 3. But really, that doesn't matter if you're doing a true commitment, as I'm going to show you later, because you do need to cover all scopes if you're going to do a true validated quality target in the world. Consumer demand, in Europe, you'll have a label on your cereal, what the carbon impact on that to get that cereal to you in a usable state. Here in North America, we just don't seem to care as much. It never caught on. I thought carbon labels were going to catch on, Doug, back here 10 years ago, because people wanted to know if all else is equal, what's that called in economics? Ceteris paribus. Well, then choose the one with less carbon, right? I'm a carbon guy, so I might even make the choice before other decisions, other variables. But not to have that is kind of shocking. But we are working on it. I was working on it with West Fraser. Other companies are definitely looking into that because as you're going to see, the supply chain grows. And if one company does it, it forces others to kind of look into it. It's this kind of growth thing that happens with supply chain management. So, and then the last one I mentioned here is risk management. It's both financial and reputational. So disclosing an organizational carbon footprint can reduce carbon emissions and enhance brand value. It's a big deal to these companies. Brand value is everything, right? They're about making money and making sure that they can continue doing so. And you can't blame them. If they don't make money and have a profit to pay their employees and to continue their business, well, that is sustainability in the business world, right? They have to kind of match it and they have to make sure that they're paying the bills first. And that's something that's been kind of hard for me to look at from a perspective sometimes, but carbon's got to come second. There's no question. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about how to do the carbon footprint and this 3-scope system that we talk about. Really, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is this amazing organization between it's a partnership between the World Resource Institute, the Business Council for Sustainable Development. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol completely works with everybody, and it's almost annoying how inclusive they are because their guidance takes years and years because they'll go out to public stakeholders, they'll come back. Someone says we didn't get a chance to submit, they'll come back and let them submit. It's a very open and dynamic system. And so they've definitely come to the top of the table. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, if you're going to do a carbon footprint for an organization, that's where you start and stop. But, ISO is the basis of a lot of regulations, and it always has been. If you don't know of ISO, it's the International Organization for Standardization. International Organization for Standardization. So it's not an acronym. People get this mixed up all the time, but what ISO is, in Greek, it means even or equal. That's why all our bank cards are equal size through the entire world. And if you've heard of ISO 5001, it's for manufacturing. And the old rule in the old days was that they had 2 manufacturers of bullets in World War II. And the bullets coming out of this manufacturer, every single one fired. And this manufacturer, they're terrible. 1 in 3 were firing. And so they literally just said, you guys do exactly what they're doing. And this is rumored how these standards started. And so ISO is known mostly for the 5000 series, but 1464 is all about carbon accounting, -1. Projects is -2, and then verification and validation, the auditing system, is -3. It's kind of neat that I'm teaching this to you right now is because they just announced a month ago that they're finally going to combine their guidance into one. And so we're just going to have one, and I'm sure, I won't stake my reputation on it, but I'm sure it will be the scope 1, 2, and 3 language. It seems to have really caught on where ISO is a little bit more stilted. ISO, I have it at home. It's like 111 pages. And that's it. Greenhouse gas protocols, volumes and volumes and volumes. So if you ever get into a gray area situation, you don't know what to do. Greenhouse gas protocol has it. They've written it. They've found it. Where ISO is perhaps a little more prescriptive and they're not going to give you those details. So both of them working together is kind of exciting. I've always told people that they're very complementary. But some of the ones for product lifecycle accounting and others did have some differences. To see them now fungible will be really good for the entire carbon accounting industry. But how long that takes, we don't know because they are a very slow organization. Just as an example, greenhouse gas protocol, it's very important up here in our neck of the woods, but the landscape removal guidance has taken years and years and years. And it's so contentious, even the forestry companies say we're not going to use it. But their science is solid. It's just these companies want to claim the carbon that they sequester in the forest, in the trees, and what's stored in the products that they create. It's like, well, pick one. You can't just double up the carbon. And although there is, I have to say, they call it an avoided delay. So if we have carbon in long stored things, pianos, furniture, the fact that it's storing that carbon and delaying the release, there is a small benefit to that, but it's not as substantial as what the trees are taking out of the atmosphere. And even Art Ferdinand and others would argue that, to be carbon neutral in a forest, it's up to 300 years. It's not just this quick turnaround that we talk about. So, yeah, some fine details there. Okay, so this is a bit of the boring section people don't like, but it's the first step you have to take, and it makes a lot of sense when you hear it. But to do a carbon footprint, you have to draw a line around the box, right? You have to know what you're measuring. And so they call that an organizational boundary. And I remember in one of my classes here, in the other room over there, I had a creative student who drew me this big purple guy called ORGOP because people were getting it mixed up to do the organizational boundary before the operational. So it was just one of those things that no student in that class ever got it wrong from that point forward. But you always do your organizational boundary first, and they give you 3 options. The first is called equity share, and I would suggest to you that this is the most equitable and most fair. If I own 50% in a company and I'm having the opportunity to benefit from 50% of that profit from that company, then I'm going to include 50% of the emissions in my carbon footprint. Makes sense. The other 2 kind of give you a way out. Operational control literally says, tell me, do you have control of the organization or do you not? Even if I own 90% of it, if you're some big owner and you kept the original owner installed that is running the show and that owner only owns 10%, but you own 90%, no, hands off. If you don't have control of environmental health and safety, control of all these other environmental policies, then you just literally exclude it from your footprint. Financial control is a bit in the middle. So if you do have financial control of a company, you include it. If you don't, you don't. If you have joint control, then it reverts back to the equity share that you have. I can tell you that the greenhouse gas protocol, every seminar that I've ever been to, people suggest just tell us one. Don't give us these options because it does drive people a bit crazy. The commercial industry, operational has to be there. And if everyone uses it, then there's not a lot of double accounting and things. Manufacturing in that, I would suggest equity share, right? It's a far more equitable way to go. But that's what a company has to decide right up front. And that will delineate, your corporate boundary. If I own this company, I don't. Do I have control? I don't. We're not measuring it. And that was an example. It was difficult for me learning that one of the pulp mills in Quesnel was partially owned by 2 companies, and neither were taking responsibility for it. And it's like, well, and you can have, about 11 lumber mills for the output of 1 pulp mill for greenhouse gases. And that's the one they choose just to swipe. So yeah, operational control can be difficult, but the other argument for this and why in Europe it's very popular is, do I really want a company in my carbon footprint and in my target that I cannot affect reductions on? No, I don't, right? Like if I'm setting a target and putting money behind it, it's tough for me to say, well, we're hoping that company does something too. So that's a lot of the justification why operational control is still used. But in my opinion, it's not the strongest one out of the 3. Okay. So now we get into the heart of it. So this is a diagram that's quite famous. You'll see it with the update. And again, if you see it earlier without the nitrogen trifluoride at the end, it's not that it's a poor graph. It's just that it was updated 2013, I believe, that they added that gas. And if you look at the middle arrow, you have scope 1, direct greenhouse gases. These are the ones that companies should be focused on. Um, they're the ones that are on your site. You're creating them based on the emissions that not just physically on site, but usually you have to look at stationary, mobile, process, and fugitive. And so what that means is if you own the trucks that are driving around and buying that fuel, then that's in your scope one as well. So really anything going directly in the atmosphere that you're a cause of. And a lot of times these are the most straightforward. We'll talk about each one of these in more depth because you have the bills, right? You have control of this. You're having to pay those. Scope two, it's almost always electricity. People will tell you scope two is electricity, but it's not just that. If you're in a district energy system and you can buy purchased heat or purchased steam or cooling, we report that here as well because it's energy based. And then my specialty is these purple arrows that everyone just takes a deep breath and goes, oh my gosh, how are we going to attempt this? And we'll talk about some of these categories one on one, but purchase goods and services, it just means like this podium, there was a certain amount of emissions that it took to get this from raw material to pressing it, to forming it, to packing it, to shipping it, to getting it here to a usable state for us. We usually don't never count those. And this is a lot of the times where embodied carbon is coming to the surface. And we're hearing that term a lot more in businesses who build a lot. And UBC, again, are very innovative, but now they're looking back in time. So they're not just doing their full carbon footprint. They're going to go back and see what was the carbon impact from all these buildings that we have built. To go back and do it in time is a difficult one. To do it up front with the architects as you're doing it makes it a lot easier. But that's just one of the categories. Capital goods is very similar. The accountants will give you a delineation between the two. Capital goods, a longer lived item. But fuel and energy related activities, this is where you put the greenhouse gas emissions from, again, getting the gas or whatever you're using to a usable state to you. Usually the factor that these big companies are using is the emissions coming out of their smokestack, just the burning of that natural gas. But they're not counting that development that had to go on, the tree clearing, the digging, the pump stations, the coroners, the elbows, every one of those has a greenhouse gas factor. And if your factor for your scope one does not include these emissions, the upstream, this is where you put them. But you have to be very careful these days because people are getting a lot better, and scope two emissions for electricity will usually include them all the way up, including transmission and distribution losses. But you have to look into your factor to see if it does. And if it doesn't, then you need to include it here. Some of the other ones are straightforward: transportation and distribution, waste, business travel, employee commuting, leased assets. And those are the upstream. So before that gets to your gate. And then downstream, you have similar transportation, although that is kind of a weird one. You would think that downstream transportation means transportation leaving my facility, but it doesn't. It means transportation that I'm paying for, but I do not own the vehicles for. So a bit of a line. So a lot of people will still have a lot of their transportation emissions, like West Fraser, when you buy wood from them, and it includes transportation to the point of sale. So they include that already. But you just got to be careful with that as well. And then the rest of them, these are the ones that really do throw people. Processing of sold products. So if you sell a pair like OSB and then it goes into furniture making, you're supposed to estimate the emissions that that furniture takes to get there. This one, use of sold products. If you're a toaster manufacturer, you literally have to estimate the amount of energy and the regions where that energy will be used that toaster is going to use in its lifetime. So some people start, oh my God, where do you get this stuff? And in fact, there are those numbers out there, and I'll show you a little bit later in the scope 3 slide. We'll learn about cradle to gate and cradle to grave. But the information's out there surprisingly and becoming even more so. But we'll talk about each one of these a bit more depth quickly. So as I said, scope 1, it really is usually the easiest one to measure. You have a lot of control over it. So as I said, on-site fuel combustion, natural gas, hot water, other processes. And I really wanted to mark this here because we're in northern British Columbia, but biofuels in scope 1 include methane and nitrous, but they do not include CO2. So even when we're measuring here from the bioenergy facility, we're measuring the nitrous and the methane, but the CO2 we're reporting outside of the boundary. And in the early days, all I would tell people is that's considered carbon neutral. But now it's a bit more of a complex dynamic, right? We're saying that the emissions have already been accounted for in the forest, and if they have been done so properly, then we've accounted for it. But it's one of those contentious issues, and a lot of people still want to, report it outside the boundary, but be very clear about it because is a lot of carbon that can be generated from biomass. But just something to watch. And that's where this new landscape and removals guidance is so important and why it's so contentious as well. Company-owned vehicles, and then fugitive emissions, so refrigerant leaks and chemical processes. So I probably should put fugitive and process emissions together, but refrigerant leaks are one of the ones in the commercial sector that are often overlooked. University in Northern British Columbia, it's probably so small it's de minimis. If you can measure something that's less than 1% and onerous to account for, you can exclude it from your carbon footprint. But remember, you're going to have to justify that to a validator once. So at least have some back of the napkin information on how you came to that conclusion. And there are some quick estimates just by square footage and all that things you can do. But yeah, in commercial sectors like refrigerant, like grocery stores and hospitals, and refrigerant leaks are often overlooked. But the old refrigerants they used to have a global warming potential of 1,400. And now the ones they're putting in our car now since, 2014, is 4. And so this is some of the stuff that people don't realize that we've been doing measurement for a while on as well, that we're not just doing it to willy-nilly and this is our carbon footprint. The whole greenhouse gas protocol and all of this structure is pushed for one idea, is to reduce the carbon after you measure it. You can't manage what you don't, or you can't manage what you don't measure. And so you're going to see that a lot in this as you go through these processes. It's not just set up to measure, they're definitely pushing you down that alley. Okay, so scope 2, I think I mentioned this, purchased electricity, but it can also be heat, steam, or cooling. And again, it's the emissions generated at the power plant. Even though we flick that light switch on and we're the user of it, the emissions are happening elsewhere, right? They're somewhere else. And we have to remember that we never, ever, ever want to double account scope 1 emissions. And theoretically, some people kind of grasp this quickly, but if every person and organization in the world did a carbon footprint, we would not ever need scope 2 or 3. These are all redundant from someone else's. So what our scope 2 is going to be the producer of electricity, scope 1. Our scope 3 emissions for business travel, that's going to be scope 1 for Air Canada. They bought the fuel, they own the planes. And so a lot of times people start freaking out, aren't we double accounting all this? Yeah, inherently. But we do not want to double account within our own footprint. That's what we're most concerned with. And inherently, we want to work to make sure that we're not double accounting all over the place, but within scopes, we don't want to double account. Between scopes, we know that that's what's happening. And so I don't know why it's fascinating to me, but it's one of the big complaints I get teaching across Canada. What about double accounting? We're beating the system up, but it's like, don't worry about it. I tell people that and they want to come up and fight me about it, but it's like, you don't want it within your own footprint, but you cannot control what other companies have chosen for their organizational boundary. So you're always going to have that different level of accounting. So just make sure within your own carbon footprint. But if you look at this great graph here, hopefully you can see all the numbers with this. Let me see if I can move this just a bit. So you see the factor from Environment and Climate Change Canada, grams per kilowatt or grams of CO2e per kilowatt hour. And the difference across our country is quite staggering. BC, we're blessed. Quebec is really blessed. Newfoundland and Labrador. And then you see Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have their issues. But Alberta, even under the current government, has done unbelievable work. When I did work for the David Suzuki Foundation, it's kind of one of the little highlights of my career is we got the coal phase out approved in Alberta when the NDP government was involved. And it happened so quickly and so well, even this conservative government didn't stop it. And last year they did have a couple coal-free days. And for Alberta to transfer that quickly, a lot of people will make the argument, well, they're just transferring to natural gas. Well, it's so much better than coal, but it's still, at least they're transferring and learning these things. And so a lot of people just want to supplement biomass, but I remember, I think it was David Klaus telling me that you need 7 train loads of wood chips compared to 1 train load of coal. Like coal is energy dense, and we know that, but we also know how bad it is. So yeah, this is the cross Canada. This is again why people talk about a national energy grid as well, balancing things out. And but whether that'll happen, who knows? But this is why other people want to talk about electric cars. There's been a study out of UBC that even in Alberta, an electric car still has a 50% benefit in emissions at that much grams per kilowatt hour. So in BC, it's just through the roof, right? You can talk about all these other components, but if you're talking about strictly greenhouse gases, it's a pretty unbelievable difference, really. Okay, so one more thing before I move on, and this is frustrates some people, and this is another thing where the greenhouse gas protocol gets a lot of feedback that just tell us what to do, give us one. But there's 2 options to measure your scope 2 emissions. One's called a location-based, and this is the one most of us use because in Canada, we're not really that advanced yet to have a lot of different factors, but it just means all over BC, they took every power producer in all of BC, measured all their greenhouse gases, measured the number of kilowatt hours that they produced in the world, and divided by it and said, well, we got 15 grams per kilowatt hour. Great. That's location-based. Put it on rail. But market-based is a bit different. It gives you the opportunity to report things that you might have purchased. If you bought into a solar farm, if you bought some renewable energy credits, if you know exactly where you're buying your power from, Nelson Power, say, and not the whole provincial grid, then this gives you that ability to get down at a bit more of a gritty level. The reason almost every company in the world is using this is because the world's leading target setting validating body is called the Science-Based Target Initiative, and it's based off the science in the Paris Agreement. And so if you want to get validated with them, you have to go through this whole process. But they will not allow offsets at all in your target. You have to make straight reductions. There's no way to game the system. There's no way. And so to do that, the only opportunity for that kind of instruments is through this market-based assessment. So renewable energy credits, all these different instruments. So you'll see a company almost always now report both. That's good practice. They report location and market, but you only choose one in your total footprint number at the end of the day. And so that's very important. And you'll see most companies, like if you look at the really progressive ones, IKEA, Apple, all the big names, their location-based stays about steady, but their market's going down. So they know that that's one of the quickest ways that they can affect reductions is just make sure they're buying power from a green power source. And in California right now, they're producing a kilowatt hour from a solar panel cheaper than anything else. But that's because their peak hour is when the sun's shining and they need electricity. It's not like us at 5 p.m. when the lights are dark and we all hit the stoves. So it's not like that everywhere, but it's pretty interesting that some of this stuff's coming to fruition. Okay, I can start rambling too much. Scope 3. So this is definitely where companies just get overwhelmed. They've done their scope 1 and 2 emissions. They're fairly comfortable with it year after year. And then they're thrown at it that you got 15 other categories to report on. Like, what are you doing to me? And in the old days, well, I shouldn't say old days, it went offline just 2 years ago. But for many years, the greenhouse gas protocol and a company called Quantis had an online tool where it took about 2 weeks with your accounting firm, and you could go through all how much you spent on stuff coming in, how much production you had, your main fuel inputs, your scope 1 and 2, things that you knew about, and then your total output of production or whatever type of business that you might be, total dollars of sales. And then it would spit out an estimate of which of those 15 categories is material to you. And validators would actually take that and say, oh, yeah, that's good then, rather than you having to go through individual categories saying, no, this doesn't apply to me. It's easy for some of them. If I don't have franchises, I don't have franchises. Boom, we're down to 14 categories right away. But other ones aren't so cut and dry. And so without that calculator now, and I think they took it off because they were criticized. Some of the spend-based factors were very generalized, and but they at least made an attempt, and it was at least somewhere where a lot of us could start. But now you literally have to sit down with either a operations control manager, an accountant, and CFO, CEO, if you can. I'm not even joking, but this is the level you want to get to go through these quickly. Purchase goods and services, they don't have to get involved. You're going to go to your accounting and purchasing department. They're going to know their top buyers. They've been asked for this all sorts of times because they schmooze up to the top ones. They want to make sure those relationships are good and solid. And so they know who your top number of suppliers are and the top dollar value. So you can quickly look into what things you can. And if you're buying a bunch of staples every year, well, you do your estimate once. There's factors from metal, form to metal. It's not going to be very impactful, but you go through and you do that. And you'll find that for purchase goods and service, you'll have two or three that come right to the top. Depends on your organization. Same with capital goods, fuel and energy related emissions. I think I told you about that. Just be careful in this category, but it is emissions that have not been captured in scope 1 and 2. And they're usually the upstream emissions to get that fuel to you in a usable state. And then waste management, it makes sense. When you throw something out, it just doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. Is it going to a landfill with methane? Is it going to a waste to energy, like in Vancouver? All these different things. And the EPA actually has 4 different factors. If you throw it in the landfill, recycle it, compost it, or burn it. They have those 4 factors for all sorts of stuff you can look at. Environment and Climate Change Canada is catching up, but the EPA for Scope 3 does still have some really important factors for you there. Business travel, employee commuting. I think we talked about that. I have a bit of a slide later on how to do employee commuting, but we'll do it fairly quickly. And then the processing of sold products, you do have to be careful. And then the end of life of sold products as well. So some do have an impact at the end, right? If some may be stored in that landfill forever if they're buried properly. Others, like wood, is going to rot into methane, and it's going to have that impact. So you just have to go through each one of these one by one. But what is scary for most people when they do it is it will be the biggest component of your carbon footprint. I don't think I think the smallest component for any company that I've seen is about 40%. But even, these forestry companies, it's 70, 80% of their carbon footprint is their supply chain, upstream and downstream. And as you can assume with a big forestry company, a lot of it's transportation, right? It's going all through the world and all these different. So yeah, it's a broad category. And the other hiccup is why it's catching on a bit is because if you do want to do a science-based target and have it validated and be able to promote that in your ESG and on your sustainability reports, they do make you do an assessment. And if your scope 3 is 40% or more, they make you include it in your final target. But, bit of a caveat, they let you set a different stringency level on it. They know that you don't have as much control over your supply chain as you do over scope 1 and 2. And so say if you had a 33% reduction in overall emissions by 2050 or 2030 in your scope 1 and 2, they might take a 15 or 20% in your scope 3 because they know it's just not equal. And so you put in those, and you have different methods. You can do intensity-based targets, but usually just a little less stringency on your supply chain. Okay, let's get into it a little bit more. So activity data, I wanted to talk about the levels of activity data. And so a lot of times, if you only have a spend metric, we spent $10,000 last year on fuel, and that's all you have. It's like you want to pull your hair out, but at least from there, you can go through and say, well, $10,000, the average liter per year was this. That doesn't give us the best estimate because we have different vehicles, but we'll at least go with that. And you're at least starting somewhere. And it's good to start because too many companies, it's called paralysis by analysis, right? You can get forms and consultants in months and months and months and just delay everything. But as long as you get going, you get started. If we wanted to step it up a bit, then we might have the actual distance traveled. So we have the odometers and the type of vehicles. Well, we're still going to try and chase that same metric, the liter at the end, because that's the important one. But now we're getting a little bit more accurate on our data. The one we want is the actual fuel receipts, the number of liters, and the type of vehicle. Bang, that's the best we're going to get. But of course, I do have another one at the bottom here, and it's the best one. If every single one of us had a measurement on our tailpipes, we got actual measurements. Not realistic, right? And even like the smokestack here, we do our best estimate, but we don't have a big thing on the top measuring it. But let me tell you that if you look into some of these greenhouse gas factors, the due diligence that they've done is unreal. They have measured those cars. They have had those meters on them over and over and over. Even the factors for BC, they have one for a hotel. They've polled every hotel in BC and said, what's your scope 1? What's your scope 2? What's your occupancy level? And so we want to be able to extrapolate that out. I even had a student here who called up the BC government because they were using the same factor, occupancy factor for our ferries as they do for airplanes. Airplanes, you have to assess at least 80% full because airlines go out of business if they're not 80% full. So you take that 80% full and you measure that per person on the amount of fuel going, right? It's very simple to get a factor to do that. But for the ferries, they were nowhere near 80% full on a yearly level. But yet the accountant who came up from the States just pulled that out of the hair because it worked for planes. And so sure enough, they worked with my student and they changed that factor the very next year to make it more accurate. So they don't want to have misrepresentation. They want to be accurate. And even if you go back, it's pretty funny. Some of the earlier volumes of the BC guide had greenhouse gas factors for chickens and cows and enteric fermentation for all sorts of different animals because they thought it might be a useful thing here in BC. It was never picked up and the work involved, so they leave that out of the latest ones. But these factors are pretty unbelievable when you do look at them. So we're always trying to get the best one. And here's an example in scope 3. So scope 3 is a bit even more difficult because a lot of times you're going to have to start with only a spend-based metric. So you identify the amount spent on the tires. So this is an example for an automobile manufacturer who has to buy tires to put on their cars. So they're trying to measure the emissions from these tires before they get them. So you can just take the amount of that you've spent on tires, and there's probably some industry average out there. If you spend this amount, it's about this much greenhouse gases. It's surprising when you look that you find these things, but they always overestimate emissions because they want to be conservative and at least have that much. So then if you actually were to identify the number of tires purchased and then use the industry average for emissions, and so what I mean by industry averages, so in BC, if you were to buy a 2x4, the BC Forest Practices Board has done an estimate for how much carbon is in that 2x4, but that's all the industries in BC combined. So they all submitted their data and they averaged that out. Still pretty good, you're getting there. But then if you can identify the precise number of tires purchased, then use the industry-wide average, now we're getting even closer, right? We're using actual numbers. We're not guessing at spend base and making an assessment. We have an actual industry average, third-party verified. We're getting there. But what all these companies and all CDP used to be called the Climate Disclosure Project. They want to just be known as the acronym now because you can report forests and water as well. But what they're all trying to push you towards is what's called the supplier supplied factor. So the actual company that you bought this from, and I have the EPD, I think it might be on the next slide. No, I took it away. I didn't want to crowd the slide, but the actual EPD for the tires, and the EPD is an environmental product declaration. And in that document, it has the carbon impact from cradle to gate and cradle to grave. So a lot of times we want the cradle to gate because that's what we're purchasing. And from that point, we may change the tire or do whatever we need to do with it. But that's what you need for those scope 3. And they're really pushing to get that information from the supplier. When I, as a scope 3 specialist, work for a company and then go ask their suppliers, hey, you got any carbon data? What? What carbon? What? Like, not a clue. But in Europe, you should see they're starting to progress. And I think the famous one is Unilever, huge company, right? Massive, 11,700 suppliers. Out of that number of suppliers, they've found that 80% of their entire footprint was out of 400 of them. So they pulled that 400 of them, and less than 10% have a carbon footprint for their product. So it's not easy to do yet. We're pushing for that. But this is part of that growth that I talked about of scope 3 that's happening, is that Walmart's now asking all their customers, and when you see it on your form, do you have a carbon footprint? Hey, do we? Well, this is Walmart, our biggest client. Like, we got to get on this, right? So it's starting to stimulate things quite quickly. My frustration is that an EPD is not just about carbon. It includes water eutrophication, acidification, all these different variables that make it a very expensive document to produce. So some companies try and just do a life cycle assessment, but the rules behind an EPD are rigid. 3 different consultants will get the same answer with the same activity data. Whereas if you have 3 consultants working on a life cycle assessment, you can do some things and you have some interpretations and the answers might be slightly different. So EPDs are really what we're searching for in a scope 3 landscape, and always third-party validated, of course. Okay. So quick example for each. Just some people are math people and they have to see it on paper, but this is simply just some emission factors. So this is from Environment and Climate Change Canada. You'll find that natural gas is very, very similar across the board. It does change from time to time, especially if they are including the upstream emissions in their factor, because some gas is a little more potent than others and takes more to get some places than others. But usually it's right around this. Big chunk for carbon dioxide, a little bit for methane, a little bit for nitrous. So if we take the greenhouse gas factors, this is literally just saying how much greenhouse gases, kilograms per gigajoule. So I should have a notation, kilograms of CO2e. So 88 gigajoules are used. For carbon dioxide, it's straightforward. We're going to multiply it by that factor, and we have our CO2e for carbon dioxide. But the next ones, we have to add that second step, right? We measure the amount of tons or kilograms of it, and then we have to multiply it by its global warming potential. And that's why you see the 28 and the 265 show up. We have to make sure the radiative forcing of each gas is taken into effect when we finally measure our last one. And that's really straightforward. When people see it on paper, they're like, oh, I could do an Excel spreadsheet like that. Yeah, and you should. There's so many software companies out there trying to give you the magic bullet right now. I have never once had them correct my Excel spreadsheet, and I have had my Excel spreadsheet correct theirs. Oh my God, I can't even tell you how many times. Like they're trying, right? It's all venture capital right now, and scope 3 is not an easy thing just to implement, but be careful. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And then I thought for electricity, I'd give you a similar one. Just again, BC is such a good place to electrify if you are going to choose to. I got an electric barbecue now I love. You never have to change the containers. It's unbelievable. I got an electric lawnmower. I got my electric car. So I'm giving her at this point and looking at solar next. But we are blessed in BC compared to a lot of different regions for the impact from it. I know that hydro has further impacts and we can't deny them. Land flooding, land use issues, First Nations displacement. But from a greenhouse gas perspective, moving water is a pretty neat thing for us. So scope 2 emissions are fairly low here. And if you do make this measurement elsewhere, you'll probably see a lot more. The reason I show you this one as well is a lot of times you will have your factor in a CO2e already. So they're not going to break up the methane and the nitrous for you. I would suggest search for it. The CDP and others are giving you extra points if you can break up your individual gases in your carbon footprint rather than just denote a CO2e. So whenever possible, avoid a CO2e factor for each of them and look for a methane, nitrous, and a CO2 factor. We want to be able to report on our carbon footprint, how much methane, how much nitrous, and how much carbon dioxide, as opposed to just the CO2e. Very important. And this slide's a little busy, sorry, hopefully you can see it, but I just really wanted to give a bit of a sense of the scope 3 and why we're looking at and why the complexity is just that much further. And so maybe I'll start with the yellow box here and cradle to grave. So it refers to the carbon emissions produced through the entire carbon product life cycle, what it takes to get it from raw material what it takes to get it to the site, what it takes to manufacture it into whatever it is, a good or a service, and then get it to the final end user that's going to happen. And then from that point, what happens at the end of its life? Is this thing used forever? Is it used for 10 years? And then what happens to it at the end? Are there emissions there? Cradle to gate, as I mentioned, is the one that we usually look for a scope 3 emission, because once we have it in our possession, we know what the emissions will be by that point, whether we're going to turn it into something else, process it, leave it as it is. But what's become very popular as well in the building industry, and I won't cloud this too much, but cradle to gate plus options. They don't want just to the gate, they want the installation and the final transportation on site. And so you'll see 3 different things now: cradle to gate, or cradle to gate plus options, cradle to gate, and then cradle to grave. But really, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? We just want to have the whole continuum. We don't want to ignore something that may have a horrible impact on a landfill just because it was clean up front. And people have done well talking about electric car productions. They finally see that their cleaner production level, where the original electric cars took more impact than an internal combustion engine car. So these are the things where we really look into it. And these, you'll see them broken up in an EPD called A1 to A2, B1 to B2, C1 to C3, and they break them up into the cradle to gate plus options, cradle to grave. And they're breaking them into those modules just so you can see a bit more individually of what it is taking it up. And I just found it fascinating. You know, you can EnvironDeck at the bottom. You can find all sorts of EPDs or just type it in. The volume of them is overwhelming because they're supposed to be a transparent public document anyway. And so you can find them quite easy. So if you ever wanted to look at it, but for this one, it's quite fascinating to me that the use stage of the tire is so high. And so I actually put down that the use stage includes activities covered from the period of the handover to the tire until it reaches the end of the life, including fuel and energy consumption. So is that compared to a baseline tire or any tire? So it's kind of interesting. You really got to dive into the weeds sometimes, but I also think it's attributable to the tire and particulate emissions. As we know, they wear down, right? Tires are heavy. And so to think this is actually causing some greenhouse gas level emission, I never would have thought that. But again, they push through and make you kind of do those measurements quite quickly. But so when you're talking about, well, scope 3, purchased tires, we just did the calculation, right? We have all the information right here that we need. We would need cradle to grave, and we need the number of tires that we purchased, and we have the tons for tires. For an auto manufacturer, that's a significant impact for their supply chain, and we just done it right quickly with a supplier supplied information sheet from Michelin. Perfect. But it's not always that way. And so you have to do your best. Yeah, okay, that's all I'll leave you with scope 3. But if you do have any problems, what I'll say with scope 3 is that the guidance on it's overwhelming. Every one of these 15 categories, there's a chapter written by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Investments, you know, unless you're a banker or a large scale venture capitalist, it probably doesn't apply to you. But to read the chapter and look into how to make sure it doesn't apply to you is always good practice. But yeah, there's a lot of guidance for each one of those 15 categories. And I tell people, just start. If you start with just paper, fine. That's fine. Just as long as you're doing something in scope 3 world, that's fantastic. And again, when the BC government chose that, I think, again, just so that people could have some impact. But paper is usually de minimis unless you're at some accounting firm or something, especially with people buying newer stuff. And anyway, okay, I think I have one slide. I was going to say I was just going to go through this quickly because I think we can all figure out how to do an employee commuting survey, right? You ask the people where you're coming from, but there are an easy way to do it. So they have an estimate just in North America that they've done North America wide for an average of emissions per employee. But you're really rounding the edges at this point, right? If you're talking about every employee in all of North America. So, but it's at least a starting point. So if you have this number of employees, you can take this generic factor, and I call that a back of the napkin calculation. But sometimes that'll suffice for a validator or a verifier for a de minimis. A lot of these manufacturing companies, employee commuting is just tiny, right? So you do it once, you show them it's tiny, but you're not going to waste your time going through doing an entire employee commuting survey to 8,000 employees if it's going to be less than 1%, because this is onerous to account for. So if it is included, there's all sorts of guidance on how to do a really good footprint. Put it on a spreadsheet, and you can get an estimate fairly quickly. But it is something that I wish that this school had done. We have done a study on this employee commuting. Steve Helly and a couple of the students, we borrowed the device from the city to measure the cars coming up the hill. We're blown away. People were going as fast as 120K up that hill. And we even measured the number of cars, and we found a lot of trucks driving up that hill as opposed to cars. And we did the impact. And I think Steve even included the embodied carbon of the cars, which I argued because it's not quite in a footprint guidance. But just the employee commuting is twice as much as our scope 1 and 2 emissions. And again, we have very low scope 1 and 2 emissions, BC in the green in the bioenergy facility. But it does speak to just one category out of those 15 that I showed you, will dwarf even scope 1 and 2. So to include it, maybe students would get more involved. Maybe there would finally be that gondola from the bottom with the parking, or all these creative ideas that have come up at the school over the years. But I do remember having, forgetting his name now, so I shouldn't bring up the story. That's terrible. He's an environmental justice prof from Tufts University in Boston, and I had to pick him up at the airport. So we're driving through town, and I pointed up at the university. He's like, "You guys cut down the middle of a forest for a university?" He's like, "Why didn't you put it downtown?" And I'm like, "I don't know. It's beautiful up there. Wait till you get there. Shut up." But it's kind of like, oh yeah, I didn't really think about that. But there's all sorts of reasons for that, and granted land, and but he had a point in certain ways. Okay, I think I have a couple more slides. Yeah, just this one, I wanted to reiterate that I think this is the final slide, or not. I have one more on carbon neutrality, but tracking all 3 scopes. If you're going to jump on this, just jump on it. Regulations are never going to ask you for scope 3, ever, because regulations focus on scope 1 and 2, and we're hoping that regulations cover those all over the place, that the scope 3 is never going to have to be addressed. But if you want this for ESG, if you want a science-based target, scope 3 must be included, and don't ignore them. You're going to find really interesting things in scope 3, and as soon as you do ask your suppliers, it will shock you. It's like, "No, but we were thinking about that. Can you help us out?" "Well, we use this control. We all used equity share. So if you use that one, it would help." And it starts snowballing. But yeah, I would clearly suggest don't ignore scope 3 right off the bat. And that's where I'm making a living across Canada right now, is just this one scope, if I can be honest. Companies are jumping on it right now. They want to include it. They want that target, and they want to look like a good corporate partner. So yeah, okay. That's supply chain. That's measuring a carbon footprint on an entity level. And I say entity level because products will be a bit different, and they're a bit more difficult. And you can just give you the example of a lumber mill again. They take that log in, and 60% of the log goes to chips. Only 40% goes to lumber. So if you're doing a carbon footprint and trying to assess those emissions, what do? So they give you 2 options. One's an economic allocation. And that one I never liked for the timber industry, because again, 60% of the log's chips, that 60% makes 8% of the profit, where the 40% is 80 or 88% of the, whatever, my math's terrible, 92% of the profit. So on the volume scale, that's just not a good way to do it. And so then we set up meters to say, well, the chips are almost do everything the lumber does, except they don't go through the drying. And that's intensive, energy intensive. So we separated out that and then set on a mass balance, where is the emissions going to? So again, a lot more complicated. All I've done today is shown you an entity level of an organization or a party. People do carbon neutral parties. But to do this, like this laptop's carbon neutral, it's a bit of a different math, and just want to make sure that we're talking about 2 different things. Okay, my last slide. I think it's an important one because it's getting mixed up quite a bit. For a long time, and in BC, we should be proud. Our public service has been carbon neutral since 2008. Not a lot of people know about that. I always thought we need a sign right on the front of the university. Like, why doesn't every university have this? Like, the amount of effort and volume of work that went into making our public sector. And if people look into what the public sector is in BC, it's ICBC, schools, universities, hospitals, all of them are measuring their carbon footprint every year and then buying offsets to balance that so it neutralizes their emissions. Very good. But the new trend is net zero. And we need to get past carbon neutrality and move to net zero. And what net zero does is definitely prioritizes deep emissions first. So you have to reduce your emissions by 90%. And then those last 10%, you can't just choose any emission offsets like we did for carbon neutrality. They have to be removals from the atmosphere. It's a far, far more stringent goal. But in this decade of action, we can't just keep writing checks. We have to start really addressing the emissions. And just as an example of how that's kind of happened in the carbon credit world, a lot of us wanted carbon credits to be very equitable, very fungible. Even our current prime minister, the job before the last one he had, was trying to form a committee to make global carbon credits one for one, because he knew the value in doing this, but it just hasn't happened. So in the regulated market in North America, a carbon credit like in Alberta, wherever it goes for about $60. On the voluntary market, it's about $1.20. Market's just fallen out because of all the crime and all the lack of additionality and all the crap offsets. And so that's really hurt carbon neutral as well, and why this net zero is prioritizing good quality offsets. And the last thing I'll say about offsets is that the bottom's fallen out for some reasons, though, like I said, the nefarious ones, but it's also for some good reasons because we've started to produce things in a better way. The example I give people in Ontario, some of the first offsets in Ontario were for an anaerobic digester at a dairy farm. Because, man, if you're capturing all those emissions from the manure, you're heating your whole place, you're producing electricity. But then in 2016, they realized that any producer who was going to actually start a dairy farm would be crazy not to put one in. The prices of the digesters came down to the point where it just became business as usual. And if it's business as usual, you cannot get carbon credits anymore. And I always tell people this is a really tough question to ask, but if you're doing the project in absence of carbon finance, it's not a carbon project. You need that carbon finance to be that extra return on investment that makes the project go forward. And there has to be a cost associated greater than business as usual. And so carbon credits themselves are a difficult body. I pop about 9 out of 10 bubbles when people come to me, I have this great carbon credit idea. No, you don't. And so it's a tough bar to set. So yeah, we're going to be careful. And a lot of these renewable energy credits are now not being looked on very good as well, because like I said, in California, renewable energy is as good as regular. So it's taking the bottom out of all these renewable energy offsets that we used to buy. So that's why when you hear net zero, I hope that it speaks to you in a greater volume, that it's a far stringent target, and that if we do meet that goal that we've set as a country by 2050, we have interim targets at 2030. All sorts of companies are making that commitment, but unless we have a decade of action, I keep referring to that, it may be difficult to meet. So I don't want to make doom and gloom. There's a lot of companies trying their best. But the challenge is there for us for sure. Okay, and then I think just any questions or discussions you might have.
Have a mic here.
Well, you have no questions. So you had carbon removal, right? So isn't that just other science involved? Like what is a carbon removal? Like what does that really mean? Right? For instance, I look at a tree, okay, for 250 years we're removing carbon, then it dies. Then over the next 50 years, it's put it all back in, right? So is a tree, like would a tree be counting as a carbon removal, or are we talking like physically removing it and permanently removing it forever, right?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Carbon into a solid custom soil and putting it in the ground, burying it, and using it to cement or whatever it is, product we're using.
Yeah, and that's why I would say stay tuned to the rules because you've hit the nail on the head. We consider carbon removals as a continuum. Mineralization that you talk about is what are considered the top one. Biochar and all these minerals that will stay sequestered for thousands and thousands of years. Other people have questioned if trees themselves are a store of carbon. But I can tell you that on a continuum of a consistently managed forest, they have proven that, there is going to be some carbon storage in there. And having them there in a good, healthy environment is better than not. And if we use them in a better way, harvest them in a better way, then we can really have trees be a part of the solution. But I would argue with you when we get to 2050 and we're looking for straight removal offsets, afforestation and reforestation probably will not qualify, in my opinion. It will be carbon capture and storage, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, or mineralization. Yeah, you hit it on the head. Absolutely. Good question.
Further questions?
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for the presentation. It's so relevant because I'm trying to expand what we're trying to measure for scope 3 at UNBC. I was wondering for the last slide, if you could go back.
Certainly.
For net zero, measuring your carbon footprint. In order to find if scope 3 is 40% of the total footprint, I assume you need to measure all of your scopes in order to determine if it's 40% or not, right?
Correct.
And so I'm just thinking there's a lot of things that companies will omit or say they don't have data for it. And is there any mechanism for people to audit and say, hey, you're not including, let's say, all of the furniture that you dispose of, for example, it uses a different company, and sometimes people would hide it. So I wonder what mechanisms are there to keep institutions accountable.
Yeah, very good. Very good question. And I'd love to tell you that there's one mechanism that everyone rules by, but that's not the case. So companies are free to set their own target, claim whatever they want in their sustainability report, exclude, include whatever they want. They can even ask their validator to come in and say, well, we're only going to do these 3 scopes, but we're going to be clear about that. But the one in the world that is catching people and that I love is SBTI. And so that's the Science-Based Target Initiative. And if you are a large organization setting a target, if you don't have an SBTI validation, then you're just kind of one of those companies who are making claims in the wind. So they consider it the most stringent, and they do validate your entire process. So they will go through your whole footprint and they'll say, what about this category? We've talked to 20 other companies similar to you, and they do include investments. Why aren't you? And they'll go back and forth. And the questions that they ask, I will tell you, are unbelievably difficult, and they're worse than an audit. They make you cringe, man. I've done it a few times, and it's not an easy process. They make sure it's rigorous. So companies don't have to use it, but that's the catch that you're talking about. That's definitely, so they validate your target before you can put it on your paperwork that you have an SBTI validated target. So yeah, very good, but I just wish every company was forced to use it, but they're not.
I'll go back to the scope 1, scope 2.
Yeah.
Delineation, right? I'm getting it back. You're just looking at your company. So I'm going to do your scope 1, scope 2. And scope 2 may be duplicating someone else's scope 1, right? That's like transportation when you add air travel.
Yeah.
So if the airline is doing scope 1 reporting on their fuel usage and of their using their aircraft for carbon, but I'm also going to put it in line with scope 2, right? So it's duplicating. Who cares? Like you say, I'm looking at my own company, they're looking at their own company, and then if I look at ourselves, eventually all comes up from smoke. That's basically what you're driving at, right?
Yeah.
The concept.
Yeah, and they put the concept of the 3 scopes saying, even though your scope 1 are the preeminent ones, the one you're actually seeing coming from your stuff, it doesn't delineate or it doesn't reduce the impact that you're having because those electricity producers wouldn't have to build all the dams or create all the coal fire plants if you weren't one of their end users. So it's kind of one of those things, do I have an obligation? And so that's where regulation usually includes scope 2. And some people have argued it shouldn't, but it's just such a high energy use and such a common one that we're all easily paying for. It's almost always included in regulation. And that's why I don't think you'll ever see scope 3 in it though, because that's already a duplication that people have concern with, but it's such a high level of, and they call electricity, what's the term? Very useful power. Like it can be used in so many other things, where natural gas, you're heating some water, you're doing your barbecue, and there's, but yeah, so very good question.
Yeah, makes sense. I kind of,
Yeah.
it was just thinking,
I sometimes throw people with telling them that concept of it. Everyone did their footprint. We'd only need scope 1. It's just a theoretical thing, right? But it is there to at least help people bridge the differences between the scopes. But yeah, we do want to look at our organization for the full impact, but realize like I said, our scope 3 commitment, our target will probably be a little bit easier to meet than our scope 1 and 2, where we have some hands in the pie and we can reduce by LED lights, efficiency, demand side management, all these things before we even think about buying from solar. So we do have a lot of control over that scope 2, and that's why it's in regulation.
and the scope 2 basically allows you to then, as you said, choose vendors that are actually doing a better job as well. Too.
Yeah, that market-based
Scope 2.
approach.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and that's why it's very popular right now. And yeah, and solar like you should see the amount of gigawatts Google and Apple and all they just instantly bought. And so the demand is there. Even renewable natural gas here. I tried to get it for the school at some point, trying to get them some just for that little portion we do have to buy, but the demand is outstripping the volume. Although I just spoke to Fortis last week, and I guess they're starting to get a little more volume, but.
Yeah, Fortis is playing a trick, right? 'Cause they're buying renewable natural gas, plant in the US. That molecule is actually consumed in the US and just doing an offset molecule pricing. You can't, because someone that burns lead, you're paying an offset renewable something, but that molecule you burn is not from that plant.
Yeah, and even some of the old laws about we had trains coming across and then going right back to get credits, and so we're definitely trying to clean up some of that. And I always tell people if you are a bit cynical, do your deep dive, and I bet you they fixed it. Like people do not want these things to continue on. So Fortis has a goal of 30 by 30, and someone just pulled that out of the hat once. And if you talk to the people at Fortis, 30% by 2030, like, where are we going to get all the vegetables, man? Like, it's just not really, but at least they put an aspirational goal, and you're going to see that in carbon a lot. It's an aspirational because we don't even know how to get there yet. And then we fumble on and then refine targets as we get closer. But remember, the original scientists from Kyoto wanted like an 80% reduction. By the time it got to print, it was a 6% reduction, because the politicians got in there. So we got to really make sure that science, academia, and our administrators, which is politics right now, are a bit more lined up. And unfortunately, politics is the wild card that sways too much.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, you hit it on the head there for sure.
I should just sit closer to the heads of the We'll get down steps in by the other day.
Well, I'll monopolize later.
Okay, yeah, I have a question about what the incentives are for institutions to actually do carbon accounting, especially for the net zero case, because I know there's some companies, they just buy credits or carbon offsets, and that's all they do. Like it's 90%, and they say, "Oh, I'm carbon neutral because I can pollute as much as I want, but I can pay the offset."
Just gonna write a check for those $1.20 offsets. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, a lot of the scope 1, I understand they want to reduce that because they pay a lot of money for it, and scope 2 as well. But for all of the downstream emissions, they don't pay for it necessarily, except maybe like, for example, waste management. I guess you pay per ton of garbage or something like that. But so I was wondering, I mean, what's the incentive? And yeah, do you find when companies start to do this, what are the benefits from that?
Yeah, so twofold. Number one, I think I put up there are those 4 different options. It's definitely investor pressure is number one. So they want to go net zero because they want to pacify all these investors, and BlackRock, like it's not a small organization. If you ever look into the holdings that they have as an investment company, and for this type of company to now be demanding it of people, you got to do it. The previous administration in the US, for the 4 years under Biden, under the Clean Inflation Reduction Act, anyone selling to the US government had to have scope 1, 2, and 3 done. It's the largest purchaser on the planet by far, largest single purchaser on the planet. You should have saw companies going freaking out getting it done. Now we have the tables flipped completely, and people like me are worried all that state action is going to stop. Well, now all the fisheries are wanting to get carbon footprints done so they can sell to Europe. They never had to have a carbon footprint for the States, but they do for Europe. So things happen like that as they go. But the number one driver, number one clearly right now, is investor and ESG reporting. So they find a benefit from reporting their sustainability report, showing they're a clean company, showing they've looked into these things, reducing their risks. Whether people are savvy enough currently to know the difference between carbon neutral and net zero, I don't know. And that's why I think a lot of companies are still staying carbon neutral and just writing the check, because it's not affecting their companies. They've done their polling, they don't care. Like if you're Harley Davidson in the US, the people under clients who care about carbon emissions are probably 0.1%. If you're an organic dog food company in California, you better have your carbon label on it. People are looking for all that stuff. So there's different market pressures coming up. I wish it was more the individuals, but it's definitely seems the investors right now, they're demanding it. They want that. And so they want that more of a stringent target and showing that you're working towards it. And I can tell you, from my years of experience, I have not worked with a single company who didn't do this. And as they reduce carbon, you hit it on the head. It's intrinsically linked with energy, right? You're saving money. You're a more efficient company by doing a carbon footprint. People can't get their heads around it. You don't have to be altruistic about carbon or climate change, or if you want to be a good, significant business, this is part of your process now for sure. Yeah, I wish there was more I could tell you that they're making $1 million by doing this, but we're hoping it grows. And, you know, at the end of this decade of action, I think the companies who are laggards will be called out. We're going to start seeing these effects even more so, right? Unfortunately, we have a lot of energy in the climate that we've put there on our own. And so I think there'll be a bit of name and shame one day. Hopefully we're at a more positive level now and we congratulate the companies who are moving forward. And then everyone wants to catch or follow them because they're profitable, sustainable, and more versatile now. But we'll see how that happens.
Sorry, to follow up on that. What about, oh, I'm sorry. Do people argue that they're afraid that the upfront costs of becoming more net zero will be on the consumer to absorb? And then are people saying, oh, you know, I don't want to pay more if, you know, it's going to affect my cost of living. I don't care about net zero. I just want it
Absolutely
as possible. And for example, if you're going to buy something really cheap, you're going to get it from really high polluting countries with low regulations and all those things, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, what are the consumers' thoughts? Yeah, I guess they're investors too. So, but yeah, I just wondered how that's going to play out.
Yeah, so let me think. There is an extra cost associated for the most part, right? Almost any change, there's going to be some cost involved. But what I find fascinating as well is that working in the corporate world, you saw that list of different companies I worked for. When we were looking at projects at the university, what's the payback period that we'd entertain? What's the longest one that you would suggest? 20? I love you. I want to hug you. See, a lot of people, because this university is going to be around for a while. I had the opportunity to work with the city of Quesnel, the province. They were looking at a longer term as well. Every organization in the corporate landscape I've worked with, they will not announce their target without doing the due diligence first to see what it's going to cost them. 4-year payback. 4-year payback. They should have been doing these projects anyways. If they're a smart business, after 4 years, you're going to reduce your bills. What have you guys been sitting on? But these big organizations and some of the top 2,000 that I've been talking about, unless it was a 2-year payback, they would not do the project. So at 4 years, you're not hurting any consumer. You're not hurting any organization. You're actually helping that company become stronger, especially after that 4th year. So there may be some upfront costs, but what we try and focus on is When the furnace dies, that's when you look at it. Don't just jump into retrofits right now if you don't have the money to, but when it comes up to replace the lights, don't put old incandescents in. That's the time to look at it. And then you mitigate that impact costs and then you spread that out. But I've been fascinated that these companies have a 4-year payback on their energy projects and they haven't been doing them. So when they tell their board, yeah, we can meet this goal, 33% reduction in 10 years, and it's only going to cost us this. And in fact, on a 10-year level, it's going to save us this. Let's get it going. Let's go. All you got to do is show the board money, long-term or short-term, and they're going to do it. But a lot of companies have a more difficult challenge up front. You know, cement manufacturers right now, they're considered, you know, so impactful that they're looking at carbon neutral concrete and all these different things, and it's costing money for that research. So I'm not trying to say there's no money involved, but I think that the impact that the consumer will have is actually a lower impact long-term. Solar panels instead of coal, man. Like the one last example I'll give you for that is sometimes we don't look at the full life cycle of something. The reason I was so proud to be a part of that coal phase out in Alberta is because when Ontario did it, it's the single greatest climate action I would consider in North America. In a 5-year period, they saved $5 billion on healthcare costs. They were subsidizing their cheap electricity with coal on asthma attacks for kids in the hospital. A couple of years ago, Toronto had the first smog-free day in their history in a summer. It's like, and it didn't break the bank. It just needed to transfer and people to realize, wow, this costs $5 billion. Let's not put that there. And maybe let's put in some nuclear facilities. Unfortunately, some of that in Ontario, but at least they addressed that horrible, horrible demon in the room. And if they didn't measure carbon, they might not have ever done that. So yeah, a roundabout way to say there are costs involved sometimes, but I think long-term, a lot of these are just win-win situations, especially as efficiency, demand-side management, that's win-win-win, right? That's through the roof. So, okay, I'm getting all excited.
Stephen, line, have any questions? Unmute or watch. Otherwise, early 1990s, my partner got involved with certifying well-managed forests and connected with that was chain of custody. And they found that as they mapped out the chain of custody, the companies, pretty much all of them, found ways to save money. So the savings more than paid for the cost doing the administration.
Oh, very good, eh?
So that was interesting. The other interesting thing was ISO got involved.
Yeah.
And it was the first time ISO, from what I understand, did a systems certification. Up until then, it was all engineering, it was manufacturing and so on. Now they had a natural system for us. So carbon and what you're accounting for here gets into that natural system basis. Has that been a problem for ISO, or did they learn enough from the forest example that this was a no-brainer?
Yeah, I think that there's two answers to that. ISO went nuts through our forest for a while is because we had that statement. The carbon from biomass is carbon neutral. But we always had that little tagline, if from a sustainably managed forest, right? If you're just depleting the carbon so bad, then we know it's not carbon neutral for sure. And that ISO, people thought that's all we need, and that'll show that it's sustainably managed. So it went wildfire. But that started this whole problem that everyone started to realize, Doug, about this. And it's not called chain of custody anymore. They really talk about traceability through the entire function of the wood. And that landscape and removals guidance, we sat on the pilot as West Fraser for 2 years. I've never sat on a committee so contentious. There was anger in the room and like unreal. And so even now that it's being piloted now, companies still don't believe. Manulife Financial, Weyerhaeuser, they have staked their carbon footprints, reputation on that somewhat double accounting of carbon. And if they don't have it, all these claims they've been making for years go by the wayside, and they're worried about that. And so they have to now make a decision whether we use an actual guidance with scientific basis or eschew it and keep doing whatever we've done in the past to game the system a bit. I'm a bit harsh on that, but I think we need to be. And it's why I'm no longer in the forest industry, and I'll consult for them, but I'm not going to be beholden to one company who might think a different perspective than what we need to. Landscape, they say it's about 29 to 30% of the world's emissions on how we manage our lands. And we haven't had a protocol till this year. It's unbelievable to me. So no, they haven't quite figured it out fully yet, I don't think. But they've definitely do their due diligence trying. And if you want to look at it, it's in pilot now and it's online landscape and removals guidance. It's fascinating, but it would take, a scientist like you or Art Ferdinand or who is that amazing guy from Spain that we had for a while? Anyway, he did tree growth analysis as well. And then like the Werner Kurtz down in Victoria, very unbelievable climate scientist for forestry, but it's a contentious issue. And it's one I think we do need to get right though. We can't be making pellets out of raw trees and things like that, thinking it's good.
So LNG, the recent proposals and announcement, they say BC or Canada's LNG is the cleanest in the world. LNG is going to emit basically the same, no matter where it's from, I would assume. So I think they're only looking at the upstream emissions, and they might be a few percent cleaner than elsewhere, and therefore they're saying they're cleanest. Is that true? Am I reading between the lines?
They're using the situation that they're compressing the liquid natural gas, because you got to compress it to make it liquid, with clean BC electricity, where the world average would be from coal, all sorts of different impacts. And so that's where they're making that claim. But if you notice, they've stopped as forcefully making the claim that our LNG is going to offset all these emissions through the world. They're going to stop using coal and use our LNG. Well, they've realized now that some of us have looked into that. They're not going to stop the coal. It's just the growth they're going to use for LNG, but it's not going to displace that. And so I got reprimanded by my company recently because I forgot that I was working with Fortis. And my line that I say in almost every presentation is that a lot of times you'll hear that natural gas is considered a bridge fuel. Lots of people have heard that. I say make that bridge as narrow and as short as possible. And Fortis didn't appreciate that and wanted me to be a bit more agnostic on gases. And I can accept that. But that's the truth of it, right? It's a fossil fuel. It's dyno diesel from the ground that we're pumping into an already polluted atmosphere. Anything else that we can do would be better. But if we can offset coal first in an interim, I'd still take that, because coal is just dirty and polluting the whole continuum of its use. And
that leads into the next question I wanted to ask. You had said that LNG was better than coal. And I was wondering if that was because of the particulates with coal, or just based on carbon emissions, or the whole package, both?
yeah, just carbon emissions. But if we are looking outside carbon, and I tell people you can't just always stay myopic on carbon, or you're not looking at the full assessment. But the biggest issue they think with coal as well is the albedo effect. This black coal dust landing on white snow, that's not a good thing. And it's the same where Oscar Garcia, that's the gentleman we had here, he would always question me on that, because all the carbon offset models for forests never took into account that now this beautiful white forest or field that's covered in snow in the winter, we're going to regrow dark trees on it. And there is an albedo effect to that. And so, yeah, I try and look at all of it, but just from a stoichiometry perspective, Doug, where how much emissions from the burnt, that's where even natural gas does beat coal.
And then the last question, I do have solar. And so if BC Hydro is on average 15 grams CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, any rough estimate what carbon emission per kilowatt hour there is with my solar?
Well, you have 0, right? But that's only if you think of the scope 2, and I want you to think of the scope 3. So what was the impact to build your solar panels? And we're knowing now they're getting unbelievably much more efficient. And if you were to equalize that over the lifespan of it, it's going to be so tiny, right? So even that 15 grams they're emitting, you're way lower than that.
Even the mining, the production, and associated with the disposal later.
They're getting so good at
I-
these things.
forward.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's good for you to think about that. It's like a truck carrying leafy lettuce compared to heads of cabbage. Well, you can fit a lot of weight worth of cabbage into that truck compared to the leafy greens. And that's why they have rooftop gardens in Vancouver just for those. So you don't have to have that transportation. And so, yeah, it's good to think about the details. But yeah, your solar panel production and end of use, just very minuscule compared to any other production type. It's very good.
Any other questions? I will say thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Doug, for having me. It's always good to be back on campus. Yeah, it's very good.